The great chamber of the Galactic Council stretched out like a crystal bowl turned upside down, and the light from 3 different suns made rainbow patterns on the walls, where 847 different species sat waiting for the humans to speak. Kang Tai-min stood at the center podium, and his dark suit looked very plain next to all the colorful aliens around him, but his face showed no fear, even though every eye and sensor and tentacle in the room was pointed at him. Park Hye-jin sat in the human section behind him, and she watched the other delegates with the careful eyes of someone who had spent years learning how aliens thought and moved and planned. High Arbitrator Zephys floated above them all like a cloud of golden light, and when it spoke, the words came from everywhere at once, making the air itself vibrate with meaning. The arbitrator said the council had made its final decision about the human problem, and now humanity must accept the new harmony protocols, or face the consequences that would surely follow. Councillor Vorthak rose from his seat, and his scales made clicking sounds as he moved, and his yellow eyes never left Kang Tai-min as he spoke about how humans were still too wild and dangerous to be trusted with full freedom in the galaxy. The Saurid leader held up a crystal tablet and began reading the new rules that would control human life from now on, and each word hit the chamber like a hammer on metal. No human colony could have more than 10 million people, and no human world could build ships bigger than transport vessels, and no human could travel to certain star systems without special permission from 3 different council committees. But the worst rule came last, and Vorthak spoke it with something that might have been pleasure in his voice when he said that human reproduction would now be controlled by the council, and only 50 billion humans would be allowed to exist in the entire galaxy. The chamber became very quiet, and even the usual whispers and clicks and hums that always filled the space seemed to stop as everyone waited to see how the humans would react. Kang Tai-min did not move for a long moment, and then he walked slowly to the speaking platform and placed his hands on the smooth surface and looked up at the arbitrator floating above. His voice was calm and clear when he spoke, and every word carried across the chamber without any electronic help, because humans had learned long ago how to make themselves heard when it mattered. He said that humanity had come to the council 30 years ago, seeking friendship and cooperation, and they had followed every rule and obeyed every restriction and tried to prove they could be trusted. Members of the galactic community. They had accepted limits on their military and agreed to inspections of their colonies and even allowed council observers to monitor their governments and economies. For 3 decades, they had been patient and hopeful, and they had believed that time would prove humans could live in peace with all the other species in the galaxy. But now the council wanted to control who could be born and who could live and how many humans could exist, and this was something no free people could ever accept. Kang Tai-min paused, and the silence in the chamber grew even deeper if such a thing was possible, and then he spoke the words that would change everything. He said that the Terran Federation formally withdrew from all council jurisdiction, and that effective immediately, humanity considered itself sovereign and free from council authority. The reaction was instant and explosive, and dozens of species began shouting and clicking and whistling all at once while their translation devices tried to keep up with the chaos. Vorthak slammed his clawed hand on his desk so hard the sound echoed through the chamber, and he demanded to know how the humans dared to reject council wisdom and protection. Other delegates jumped to their feet, and some of them seemed angry, while others looked confused and a few appeared to be frightened by what they had just heard. The arbitrator's light grew brighter, and its voice boomed out commanding silence and order. But the noise continued as representatives tried to understand what had just happened. No species had ever left the council before, and the legal experts began frantically checking their databases to see if such a thing was even possible under galactic law. Park Hye-jin stood up and walked calmly to where Kang Tai-min waited, and she carried a small device that she connected to the chamber's information network. Data began flowing into the council systems faster than their computers could process it, and warning. Lights started flashing on displays throughout the chamber. She announced that the information now entering their networks contained complete details of human military capabilities and industrial capacity and population figures, and that the council should study it carefully before making any decisions about how to respond to humanity's withdrawal. Vorthak demanded that the data transfer be stopped immediately, but Park Hye-jin smiled and told him it was already complete, and that every council member now had access to the real facts about human civilization. The chamber erupted again as delegates realized that the humans had been hiding their true strength for 3 decades, and that everything the Council thought it knew about humanity might be completely wrong. Some species began demanding immediate military action, while others called for negotiation and compromise, and a few smart ones started quietly calculating what this revelation might mean for their own positions in the galaxy. Kang Tae-min raised his hand, and somehow his simple gesture cut through all the noise and confusion and brought a temporary quiet to the chamber. He said that humanity bore no ill will toward any species in the Council, and that they would honor all existing trade agreements and diplomatic arrangements until they expired naturally. But he also said that humans would no longer accept any Council authority over their internal affairs, and that any attempt to enforce the Harmony Protocols would be considered an act of aggression. The arbitrator demanded to know what humanity intended to do now that they had rejected the wisdom and protection of the Council. Kang Tae-min looked directly up at the floating energy being and said that humans intended to be free and that they would make their own choices about their future without asking permission from anyone. He added that the galaxy was big enough for everyone and that there was no reason why different species could not coexist. Without one group trying to control all the others, Park Hae-jin activated another device, and suddenly holographic displays appeared throughout the chamber, showing star maps and fleet positions and industrial installations that no Council survey had ever detected. The images showed human colonies on worlds the Council had never heard of, and shipyards hidden in dark space and research facilities that had been operating in secret for decades. Vorthak stared at the displays, and his scales turned a darker color as he realized that humanity had not been hiding from the Council, but had been preparing for this exact moment. Other delegates began frantically messaging their home governments as they understood that the balance of power in the galaxy had just shifted in ways they could not yet comprehend. The arbitrator's light flickered as its consciousness processed the implications of what it was seeing, and for the first time in centuries, the ancient being seemed uncertain about what should happen next. Kang Tae-min and Park Hae-jin gathered their materials and prepared to leave the chamber, and as they walked toward the exit, the human ambassador spoke one final time. He said that the door would always be open for peaceful cooperation and trade between humanity and any species that wanted such a relationship based on mutual respect rather than domination. But he also said that the time for treating humans like children who needed Council guidance was over, and that from now on, humanity would stand as equals in the galaxy, or they would stand alone. The two humans left the chamber, and behind them 847 species tried to understand how their ordered galaxy had suddenly become a very different and much more dangerous place. The golden light of the arbitrator dimmed as the ancient being contemplated the end of an age that had lasted for thousands of years and the beginning of something entirely new and unpredictable. The emergency session of the Council Intelligence Committee began just 6 hours after the humans left, and the mood in the secure briefing room was unlike anything the veteran analysts had ever experienced. Director Zyloth of the Mantid Intelligence Service spread his forearms wide as he tried to explain to the other committee members why their entire understanding of human civilization had been completely wrong. The data that Park Hae-jin had uploaded was massive and detailed, and every piece of information they analyzed made the situation worse than anyone had imagined. Dr. Choi Mi-young appeared on the main screen through a secure transmission from the Human Research Station at Wolf 359, and her calm smile made the alien intelligence officers feel even more uncomfortable. She explained that for 30 years, humanity had been operating under what she called voluntary technological restraint, and that every demonstration of human science and engineering had been carefully limited. To avoid alarming other species, the reactor technology that humans had shared with the Council was actually from their archives and was based on designs that were over a century old by human standards. The faster-than-light drives that the Council considered advanced human engineering were actually emergency backup systems that human cargo ships used when their main engines needed maintenance. Dr. Choi brought up holographic displays showing the real human fleet, and the numbers made several. Committee members leave the room to contact their home governments immediately. Admiral Lee Dong-wook joined the transmission from his flagship somewhere in the Centauri system, and his presence alone was enough to make the alien military experts pay very close attention. The Admiral explained that the small defensive fleet the Council had cataloged was actually just the Home Guard and represented less than 5% of total human military capability. The real Terran defense fleet was spread across hidden bases in dark space and included ship classes that the Council had never seen and weapons systems that operated on principles the aliens did not understand. Captain Nam Ji-ho appeared on a secondary screen, and his special operations team had been working for 20 years to map every Council military installation and government facility and trade route in the galaxy. He showed the committee detailed blueprints of their own headquarters building and security protocols and emergency procedures that were supposed to be classified at the highest levels. The captain explained that human intelligence operations had been so successful because most species never bothered to look carefully at human diplomatic and trade missions. Every human embassy had been gathering information, and every human merchant ship had been scanning and recording everything it encountered, and every human tourist had been taking pictures and measurements. The committee members realized that while they had been watching humanity through their official monitoring programs, the humans had been watching them through methods the aliens never even considered. Counselor Thys of the Insectoid Collective began clicking rapidly, as his species did when they were extremely agitated, and he demanded to know how long this deception had been going on. Dr. Choi smiled again and explained that it was not really deception, because humans had never lied about their capabilities and had simply chosen not to volunteer information that was not requested. When the Council asked about human population, the humans had given accurate counts for their registered colonies, but had never mentioned the hidden settlements when the Council inspected human shipyards. The humans had gladly shown them the civilian construction facilities, but had not offered tours of the military installations. The aliens began to understand that humanity had been following the exact letter of every agreement while completely ignoring the spirit of Council oversight. Admiral Lee Dong-wook brought up tactical displays showing the current positions of Council fleets and the human forces that were quietly observing them. Every major Council military base had at least 3 human stealth ships watching it and recording everything that happened. Every Council patrol route was known and tracked and predicted by human strategic computers that had been analyzing alien military patterns for decades. The Admiral mentioned, almost casually, that if the Council chose to take military action against human colonies, the war would be over before most Council species even realized it had begun. Captain Nam Ji-ho added that human special forces teams had already identified key targets on every Council world and could disable the alien command and control systems within hours if necessary, but he also stressed that humanity preferred not to use these capabilities and hoped that the Council would choose to accept the new reality peacefully. The committee members began asking desperate questions about human technology and capabilities, but the answers only made things worse. Human faster-than-light drives were at least 3 generations ahead of anything the Council possessed and could cross the galaxy in days rather than months. Human manufacturing was almost entirely automated and could produce ships and weapons faster than the Council could count them. Human science had solved problems that the aliens were still struggling to understand and had developed technologies that seemed almost magical. Dr. Choi explained that human research had continued advancing during the 30 years of Council membership, while the aliens had assumed that humanity was learning from them. The truth was that humans had been politely listening to Council science lectures while privately developing innovations that made alien technology look primitive. The committee finally asked the question that everyone was afraid to hear answered and wanted to know what humanity intended to do with all this hidden power. Admiral Lee Dong-wook said that humans had no interest in conquering or controlling other species and simply wanted to be left alone to develop their own civilization. But he also made it clear that humanity would defend itself against any attempt to impose the Harmony Protocols, and that the Council should think very carefully before testing human resolve. Captain Nam Ji-ho mentioned that several species had already sent private messages expressing interest in separate agreements with humanity outside of Council framework. These species had apparently been watching the data revelations and calculating their own positions in a galaxy where humanity was clearly much stronger than anyone had realized. The committee session ended with Director Zyloth admitting that the Council had been operating under completely false assumptions about the balance of power in the galaxy. The Mantid intelligence Chief recommended immediate reassessment of all strategic planning and suggested that the Council consider negotiating with humanity from a position of realistic understanding rather than imagined superiority. As the transmission ended the committee, members sat in stunned silence while they contemplated the collapse of everything they thought they knew about galactic politics. Some of them began writing reports to their governments while others started making private communications to explore what this new reality might mean for their own species. Director Xyloth remained in his chair long after the others had left, and his compound eyes reflected the glow of the displays that still showed human capabilities far beyond anything the Council could match. He realized that the intelligence failure was not just about military strength or technology, but about completely misunderstanding the nature of the species they had been trying to control. Humanity had played a game that the Council never knew existed and had won it so completely that the aliens were only now beginning to understand that there had been a game at all. The Mantid director began writing his final report and recommending that the Council abandon any thoughts of enforcing the Harmony protocols. But he suspected that not all Council members would be wise enough to accept the new reality, and that the galaxy was about to become a much more interesting and dangerous place outside the committee room emergency. Sessions were beginning in every major Council facility as species after species tried to understand what the human revelation meant for their own survival and prosperity. The age of Council dominance was ending, and something new was beginning. But nobody yet knew what shape the future would take. Minister Yoon Soo-jin sat in her office overlooking the bustling spaceport of New Seoul and watched as the first wave of economic chaos began spreading across the galaxy like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Her communication array lit up with incoming messages from alien governments and corporations who were just beginning to understand what humanity's withdrawal from the Council would mean for their own economies. The Valerian Mining Consortium was the first to panic, and their crystalline representatives appeared on her screen with their usual blue glow, flickering frantically as they tried to comprehend the disaster facing their civilization. For 15 years, the Valerians had been selling their rare quantum crystals to human corporations at prices that seemed almost too good to be true, and now they realized why. The humans had not been buying the crystals for energy storage as they had claimed, but had been using them to build quantum processors for the massive computer networks that controlled their hidden military and industrial systems. Without the human purchases, the Valerian economy would collapse within months because no other species needed quantum crystals in such quantities or could afford to pay the prices that humans had been offering. Minister Yoon explained politely that existing contracts would be honored until their expiration dates, but that renewal would depend on Valerian recognition of human sovereignty outside Council authority. That crystalline beings began changing colors rapidly, which was their equivalent of panic, and they asked desperately what they could do to maintain their relationship with humanity. Yoon told them that humans were always interested in fair partnerships with species who respected their independence, and that new agreements could certainly be negotiated between sovereign equals. The Aquatic Depths Federation contacted her next, and their underwater cities had been providing food exports to human colonies for over 20 years, without realizing how dependent they had become on this single market. Ambassador Kim Jae-sung appeared on the secondary screen from his ship near the Depths' homeworld, and he confirmed that the aquatic aliens were facing complete economic collapse if human food imports stopped. More than 60% of their agricultural production was going to human colonies, and the organic sea fruits that they cultivated were considered luxury items by most other species, who could not afford to buy them regularly. Kim explained that he had already received authorization to negotiate new bilateral trade agreements with any species willing to recognize human independence from Council authority. The terms he was offering were actually better than what the Federation had been getting under Council oversight, because humans were willing to pay premium prices for quality food products, but the agreements would only be available to species who formally withdrew from Council jurisdiction over trade policy and established direct diplomatic relations with humanity. The Depths Federation representatives began the complex gill fluttering that indicated serious consideration and asked for time to consult with their deep city councils. Meanwhile, the Thylorian merchant princes were discovering that their entire trading empire was built on foundations that had just turned to sand merchant Prince Thylos contacted Yoon from his flagship and his colorful feathers. were drooping in the way that indicated severe stress among his avian species. For decades, his fleets had been moving human-manufactured goods throughout the Outer Rim territories and taking substantial profits from the markup on items that seemed reasonably priced. Now he realized that humans had been deliberately keeping their prices low to build market share and establish trade relationships, while their real manufacturing capacity remained hidden. The holographic displays in his cargo holds showed warehouses full of human electronics and tools and vehicles that would soon become worthless because humans could flood any market with superior products at impossible prices. Thylos demanded to know how humans could manufacture such high-quality goods so cheaply, and Yoon smiled as she explained the reality of automated human industry. The factories that produced goods for alien consumption were actually just small demonstration facilities, and the real human manufacturing was done by vast automated complexes that could produce anything in almost unlimited quantities. Human labor costs were essentially zero, because robots and artificial intelligence handled most production, and human efficiency was thousands of times higher than anything other species had achieved. The merchant prince realized that he could never compete with human manufacturers once they decided to enter a market seriously, and his trading empire would crumble within months. But Yoon offered him an alternative and suggested that Thylorian merchants could become exclusive distributors for human products in certain territories under new partnership agreements. The profits would be different, but the volume would be so much higher that his fleets could actually make more money than before while providing better products to his customers. Several council member species began sending private diplomatic messages expressing interest in separate negotiations with humanity outside the official council framework. The Hexapod Engineering Guild contacted Kim Jae-sung directly and offered to share their advanced construction techniques in exchange for access to human manufacturing technology. The Crystalline Collective began quietly inquiring about establishing research partnerships with human scientists who might be interested in studying their unique mineral formations. Even some of the older and more established species started exploring what bilateral relationships with humanity might offer compared to the restrictions and bureaucracy of council membership. 3 minor species formally announced their withdrawal from the council within the first week and declared their intention to negotiate independent agreements with the Terran Federation. The fungal networks of Mycos 7 had always been frustrated by council regulations that limited their biological research, and they saw an opportunity to work with humans who seemed more open to innovative science. The nomadic clans of the Void had never really fit into the council structure anyway, and they were attracted by human offers of unrestricted travel and trade throughout human space. The machine intelligences of Nexus 4 had been developing artificial consciousness, technologies that the council considered dangerous, but humans were interested in collaborative research. Each defection made the remaining council members more nervous, and some species began to wonder if they were on the wrong side of a historical transformation. Counselor Vorthak tried to organize economic sanctions against humanity, but discovered that the council could not function without human participation in dozens of critical supply chains. Human corporations had quietly made themselves essential partners in everything from food distribution to rare mineral processing to advanced technology manufacturing. The sanctions would hurt council species more than they would damage humanity, and several governments threatened to withdraw from the council if Vorthak pushed forward with his plans. Ambassador Kim Jae-sung began holding regular diplomatic receptions on his ship, and representatives from dozens of species attended these informal gatherings to explore new possibilities. The conversations were always polite and respectful, but the message was clear that humanity was offering partnership to any species willing to abandon the council system of imposed authority. Some aliens attended out of curiosity, while others came because their governments had secretly instructed them to investigate alternatives to council membership. The economic pressure continued building as more species realized how dependent they had become on human technology and trade and manufacturing. Human fusion reactors powered thousands of alien facilities, and human computer systems managed logistics networks across hundreds of worlds, and human medical equipment kept millions of aliens healthy. None of these systems would stop working immediately, but the maintenance contracts and replacement parts and technical support would end when existing agreements expired. Species that wanted to maintain their technological infrastructure would need to negotiate new arrangements with humanity under terms that recognized human sovereignty. Minister Yoon received reports showing that galactic trade volume had dropped 30% in just 2 weeks, as species tried to understand what the new economic reality would look like. But human colonies were actually experiencing economic growth because they were no longer sending tribute payments to the Council and could invest their resources in local development. The contrast was becoming obvious to everyone, and more species began quietly asking their economists to calculate the real costs and benefits of Council membership. Ambassador Kim Jae-sung announced the formation of a new organization called the Free Trade Alliance, which would be open to any species willing to respect the sovereignty of all members. The alliance charter prohibited any member from claiming authority over the internal affairs of other members and established principles of voluntary cooperation rather than imposed compliance. Within days, 12 species had expressed formal interest in joining the alliance, and several more were conducting internal debates about abandoning the Council system. The galaxy was reshaping itself around new centers of power and influence, while the Council struggled to understand how it had lost control so quickly and completely. General Oh Sang-min stood on the bridge of the battleship Indomitable and watched the tactical displays showing Council fleet movements throughout the galaxy as the political situation continued deteriorating with each passing day. The Galactic Council had fractured into 3 distinct factions, and the arguments in their chambers had become so heated that several sessions had ended in physical confrontations between different species. Councillor Vorthak led the hardline faction that demanded immediate military action to force humanity back into compliance with Council authority, and his supporters included most of the older species who had dominated galactic politics for centuries. The moderate faction was led by Councillor Nexara, whose crystalline people had always preferred negotiation to conflict, and who argued that the Council should seek new arrangements with humanity based on mutual respect. But the most dangerous development was the growing group of species who were secretly planning their own withdrawal from the Council and who were sending private diplomatic missions to negotiate with human representatives. General O received intelligence reports showing that 17 species were actively considering leaving the Council, while another 30 were exploring what membership in the Human Free Trade Alliance might offer their civilizations. The military situation was becoming increasingly tense as Vorthak pushed for authorization to deploy Council enforcement fleets against human colonies that had refused to implement the Harmony Protocols. Captain Bae In-suk contacted the general from her position near the Council military headquarters at Nexus Prime, and her special operations teams had been monitoring alien military communications for weeks. She reported that Vorthak had finally convinced enough Council members to authorize what they called enforcement action against 3 human colonies that had been established without Council permission. Saurid leader believed that a quick demonstration of Council power would force humanity to negotiate from a position of weakness and would discourage other species from following the human example. General O smiled grimly as he realized that Vorthak had just made the mistake that human strategists had been expecting and preparing for since the withdrawal from Council authority. The human response was swift and overwhelming and designed to demonstrate capabilities that would end any thoughts of military confrontation before it could begin. 6 Council military bases suddenly found themselves surrounded by human fleets that had emerged from dark space without any warning or advance detection. The alien commanders were shocked to discover that their supposedly secret installations had been under constant surveillance and that humans knew the exact location and defensive capabilities of every Council military facility. Captain Bae broadcast a simple message to all Council forces, explaining that humans knew where everything was and strongly suggesting that Council military units stand down immediately. The message included detailed specifications of every ship in the Council fleets and the names and personal information of every commanding officer and technical readouts of their weapons and defensive systems. Human stealth ships materialized throughout Council space and began broadcasting live video feeds from inside supposedly secure military facilities. The feeds showed human operatives moving freely through alien command centers and accessing classified computer systems and reading secret documents, while security personnel remained completely unaware of their presence. General O appeared on communication screens throughout the galaxy, and his calm demeanor was more frightening to the aliens than any aggressive threats could have been. He explained that humanity had been monitoring Council military activities for 20 years and had developed countermeasures for every weapon system and tactical doctrine in the alien arsenal. The human fleets that had surrounded the Council bases were just a small demonstration of capabilities that included technologies the aliens did not understand and could not effectively resist. But the general also stressed that humans had no desire for conquest or domination and simply wanted to be left alone to develop their civilization without Council interference. He offered to withdraw all human forces immediately if the Council abandoned any plans for military action against human colonies and recognized human sovereignty over their own territory. Councillor Nexara seized the opportunity to address the Council emergency session and argued passionately that military confrontation with humanity would be both futile and catastrophic. The crystalline being pointed out that humans had chosen diplomacy for 30 years while possessing the capability to impose their will by force, and that this restraint should be respected rather than tested. She revealed that human negotiators had been offering generous terms for peaceful coexistence, while alien leaders had been planning military actions that could only result in disaster. The moderate faction gained strength as more species realized that the Council was facing a conflict it could not win against an opponent who was offering reasonable alternatives to war. 7 more species formally withdrew from the Council during the emergency session and declared their intention to join the Human Free Trade Alliance immediately. The defections included the avian republics, whose trading fleets had always been frustrated by Council regulations, and the Silicon-based collective, whose artificial intelligence research had been restricted by alien fears. Each withdrawal weakened the Council's authority and made it more difficult for the hardline faction to maintain support for military action against humanity. Captain Bay reported that Council military commanders were refusing orders to advance against human positions because their own tactical computers showed that such an attack would result in complete destruction of Council forces. The alien officers had studied the human demonstration of capabilities and concluded that resistance would be suicide rather than heroic defense of Council principles. General O received a private communication from Admiral Thys of the Insectoid Naval Command, who admitted that the Council had been completely outmaneuvered by human strategic planning. The Admiral explained that his species had spent centuries believing they were managing human development and guiding humanity toward eventual integration into the galactic community. But now, it was obvious that humans had been studying alien psychology and politics and technology while developing their own capabilities far beyond anything the Council had imagined possible. The insectoid officer asked whether humanity would be willing to negotiate a separate peace agreement that would allow his species to withdraw gracefully from the Council system. General O replied that humans bore no grudges against species who had acted according to their understanding of the situation, and that fair agreements could certainly be reached with any government willing to respect human sovereignty. The conversation was monitored by intelligence services throughout the galaxy, and within hours, dozens of other species were sending similar private messages to human, military, and diplomatic representatives. Councillor Vorthak made one final attempt to rally support for military action, but his speech was interrupted by reports that 3 more Council members had voted to withdraw and that 2 others were holding emergency sessions to consider similar action. The Saurid leader realized that his hardline faction was collapsing and that the Council itself was disintegrating as more species chose to abandon the organization rather than risk conflict with humanity. Captain Bay sent her final report, confirming that all Council military forces had stood down and that human fleets were withdrawing to their original positions as promised. The demonstration had achieved its purpose of showing that military confrontation would be pointless, while also proving that humans preferred negotiation to conquest, even when they held overwhelming advantages. General O addressed his fleet commanders and explained that the military phase of the crisis was over and that the future would be determined by diplomats and economists rather than soldiers. But he also ordered continued surveillance of all remaining Council forces, because some species might still choose desperate actions as their political system continued collapsing around them. The galaxy had learned that humanity possessed the power to enforce its will, but had chosen to use that power only to defend the right to be left alone. This lesson would reshape galactic politics for generations to come as species learned to deal with neighbors who were strong enough to demand respect, but wise enough to offer partnership instead of domination. The council that had ruled the galaxy for thousands of years was breaking apart, and something new was emerging from the ruins of the old order. President Lim So-young stood before the assembled representatives of 234 species on the neutral world of Haven Station and knew that she was witnessing the birth of a new galactic civilization. 6 months had passed since humanity's withdrawal from the Galactic Council, and the old order had collapsed more completely than even the most optimistic human planners had predicted. The council chambers on Nexus Prime now echoed with the voices of only 43 species. While the rest of the galaxy had chosen to join the Cooperative Systems Alliance that humanity had proposed as an alternative ambassador, Kwon Min-ho presented the Alliance Charter to the gathering, and his words carried across the station through translation systems that had been upgraded with human technology to ensure perfect understanding between all species. The charter was simple and revolutionary and established principles that the galaxy had never seen implemented on such a scale. Before this moment, no member species could claim authority over the internal affairs of any other member, and all cooperation would be voluntary rather than imposed by superior force or political pressure. Trade agreements would be bilateral between interested parties, and no central authority could dictate economic relationships or restrict commerce between willing partners. Military alliances would be defensive only, and no member could be required to participate in conflicts that did not directly threaten their own territory or people. The document explicitly prohibited the kind of species-wide restrictions that the old council had tried to impose on humanity and guaranteed that each civilization would remain sovereign over its own development. Former Councillor Theiss of the Insectoid Collective had become one of the strongest supporters of the new system, and his species had been among the first to ratify the Alliance Charter. He addressed the gathering and admitted that his people had spent centuries believing they were guiding human development while never realizing that they were being carefully managed by human strategists. The insectoids had thought they were teaching humans about galactic politics, while humans were actually studying alien psychology and planning for this exact transformation of interstellar relationships. Theiss explained that the revelation had been humbling but also liberating, because his species no longer needed to maintain the pretense of wisdom and authority over civilizations they did not really understand. Ambassador Kwon revealed that humanity's withdrawal from the Council had been planned from their very first day of membership 30 years earlier. Every compromise and every patient acceptance of restrictions had been part of a long-term strategy to demonstrate that the Council system was fundamentally flawed and unsustainable. Human negotiators had documented every instance of council overreach and every example of species being forced to accept policies that violated their cultural values or economic interests. The goal had never been to destroy the old system through military conquest, but to provide such a clearly superior alternative that rational beings would choose to abandon the council voluntarily. President Lim explained that humans had learned from studying thousands of years of galactic history and had identified the fatal weakness in every previous attempt at interstellar government. Problem was always the same, and involved one group trying to impose its will on others who had different needs and different ways of thinking about civilization. The alliance was designed to avoid this trap by explicitly rejecting any claim to universal authority and instead encouraging cooperation between sovereign equals who could benefit from working together. The economic results spoke for themselves, and trade volume within the alliance had increased by 300%, while development aid and technology sharing had accelerated beyond anything the galaxy had seen. Species that had been stagnating under council regulations were experiencing rapid growth and innovation as they gained access to human technology and unrestricted markets. The Valerian Mining Consortium had become partners with human quantum computer manufacturers, and their crystal production had expanded to supply demand throughout the alliance. The Aquatic Depths Federation had developed new agricultural techniques with human assistance, and their food exports now fed colonies throughout dozens of star systems. Even former enemies were finding common ground within the alliance framework, and species that had been in conflict for centuries were discovering That cooperation offered better solutions than warfare. The nomadic clans and the territorial enclaves had been fighting over border worlds for generations, but alliance mediation had helped them establish trade agreements that benefited both civilizations. President Lim announced that alliance membership now included over 70% of known galactic civilization and that applications were still being received from species who wanted to join the new system. The remaining council members were welcome to maintain their organization, but they would need to accept that the galaxy had moved beyond their authority and would not return to the old ways. Councillor Forsake still issued proclamations from the nearly empty council chambers, but his words carried no weight, and most of his own species had begun questioning whether their leader represented their interests. The Saurid military had quietly opened communications with Alliance diplomatic representatives, and several Saurid colonies had applied for independent membership despite their government's official opposition. Ambassador Quan presented the final surprise of the ceremony and announced that Alliance headquarters would rotate between member worlds on a regular schedule rather than being permanently located on any single planet. This decision ensured that no species could claim special status within the Alliance and demonstrated the commitment to true equality between all members, regardless of their size or power. The ceremony concluded with the signing of the Alliance Charter by representatives from species that had never imagined they could work together as equals. President Lim watched as former enemies shook hands and tentacles and claws while promising to build a galaxy based on mutual respect rather than imposed authority. She knew that the transformation was not complete and that challenges would certainly arise as hundreds of different civilizations learned to cooperate without central control. But the foundation had been established, and the principles were clear, and the galaxy had chosen hope over fear and partnership over domination. Human children would grow up in a universe where their species was respected as equals rather than managed as potential threats. Other species would develop their own paths toward advancement without being forced to conform to alien ideas about proper civilization. The old dream of unity through conquest had been replaced by the new reality of cooperation through choice, and the galaxy would never be the same. In the abandoned council chambers on Nexus Prime, the lights grew dimmer each day as maintenance systems shut down and the once mighty organization faded into history. The future belonged to those who understood that true strength came not from the power to control others, but from the wisdom to offer them something better than what they had before. Humanity had won, not by defeating the Council, but by making it irrelevant, and that victory would echo through the centuries as an example of what patient planning and generous vision could accomplish. The galaxy was finally free to become what its people chose to make it, rather than what others demanded it should be.